East Hampton, 1971. A thick coastal fog rolls over the dunes. The kind of morning that makes million-dollar beach houses look like they're floating in gray silk. And there, behind a tangle of overgrown trees on West End Road, stands Grey Gardens. From the outside, it's poetry. Weathered shingles, ivy climbing the walls, the romantic decay of old money, slowly surrendering to the salt air. It looks like an elite retreat. But it's actually a trap. Because behind those shingled walls, a dark secret is being eaten alive by its own history. Not by time, not by neglect, by something far more methodical. By the collapse of the invisible machine that kept it breathing. Inside, the kitchen has fallen into the basement. Raccoons nest in the walls. 1,000 pounds of trash and cat food cans are stacked in rooms that once hosted senators and socialites. 2 women, a mother and daughter, live in this crumbling monument, isolated from the world, survivors of a shipwreck that happened on dry land. Their names are Edith Bouvier Beale and Edith Bouvier Beale. Big Edie and Little Edie, the aunt and cousin of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And this is not a story about eccentricity. This is a forensic investigation into how a house becomes a diagnosis, how architecture stops being real estate and starts being pathology. Most people know Grey Gardens from the documentary, the headscarf costumes, the singing, the tragedy framed as performance art. But they don't know the autopsy. They don't know about the ghost staff of 1924, the financial hemorrhage of 1946, or the biology of decay that turned a Gilded Age masterpiece into a living tomb. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, the hidden machinery behind mansions, and the dark truths history tried to bury, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin the examination. This is the dark story of Grey Gardens. And we're not here to romanticize. We're here to diagnose. But before we can understand how it died, we need to meet the family that built the cage. To understand Grey Gardens, you have to understand the Bouvier, not the house, the bloodline. Because in America's Gilded Age, your last name wasn't just identity, it was currency, it was access. It was a contract with society that said, we matter and you don't. The Bouvier family was old money in the most literal sense. French immigrants who arrived in America in the early 1800s and immediately began accumulating what mattered: land, stock portfolios, and the kind of social connections that opened every door in New York and East Hampton. Major Bouvier, the family patriarch, made his fortune on Wall Street. Not through labor, through speculation, buying low, selling high, and never touching the machinery that actually created wealth. By the early 1900s, the Bouviers were exactly where they wanted to be. Summers in the Hamptons, winters in Manhattan. A rotating cast of servants who knew better than to make eye contact. And in 1917, Edith Ewing Bouvier, known as Big Edie, married Phelan Beale, a lawyer from one of New York's other aristocratic families. This was not a love match. This was a merger. Big Edie was beautiful, charismatic, a trained singer who could command a room. Phelan was ambitious, calculating, a man who saw marriage as a strategic acquisition. Together, they had 3 children. The youngest was named Edith Bouvier Beale. Little Edie. And Big Edie's niece, born in 1929, would grow up to become the most famous woman in America. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Jackie. So when you say Grey Gardens was the home of Jackie Kennedy's relatives, you're not talking about distant cousins. You're talking about the aunt who helped raise her. The family estate where young Jackie spent summers learning what it meant to belong to American royalty. This is important, because when Grey Gardens began to collapse decades later, it wasn't just a house falling apart. It was a Kennedy falling apart. And that made it a national scandal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we need to see what Grey Gardens looked like when the machinery of privilege was still running. When the invisible hands were still working. When the house was still a house, and not yet a tomb, Let's go back to 1897 when Grey Gardens was born. 1897. East Hampton is not yet the celebrity playground it will become. It's a quiet fishing village on the eastern tip of Long Island, where Gilded Age families are just beginning to buy up coastline and build their summer retreats. The land at 2 West End Road is perfect. 4 acres of dunes, beach plum, and wild roses that slope down toward the Atlantic. The air smells like salt and money. And the architect hired to design the house is a man who understands exactly what his clients want. Not just beauty, control. His name is Joseph Greenleaf Thorpe, and his specialty is shingle-style architecture, the distinctly American design philosophy that tried to make mansions look humble. Shingle style. Let me explain what that means. Instead of stone or brick, the entire exterior is covered in wooden shingles that weather to a soft gray. No ostentatious columns, no marble facades. Just clean lines, asymmetrical roof lines, and massive windows that pull the landscape inside. It was architecture that whispered instead of shouted. But make no mistake, Grey Gardens was massive. 14 rooms, including servants, quarters built into the back wing, deliberately hidden so guests would never have to see the people who cooked their meals or washed their sheets. The cost to build it was roughly $60,000. That's approximately $1.8 million in today's money. And that's just construction. The gardens came next. And they weren't gardens in the casual sense. They were engineering. The first owner, Mrs. Robert C. Hill, worked with landscape architect Ruth Dean to create something extraordinary. Formal hedges imported from England, a lily pond stocked with rare aquatic plants, pathways designed to guide you through blooming rose beds, past trellises heavy with wisteria, all the way down to a private view of the ocean. And in 1913, tall concrete walls were imported from Spain and built around the property to protect the delicate gardens from the fierce coastal winds that could shred petals and snap stems overnight. Big Edie, who would buy the house in 1924, fell in love with those gardens. She loved the way the coastal fog rolled through them in the mornings, turning everything soft and gray. That's why she renamed the estate Grey Gardens. Not for sadness, for beauty, for the mist that made her feel like she was living inside a watercolor painting. But here's what the architectural magazines never told you. A house like this doesn't run itself. The shingles had to be maintained. The 4 acres had to be landscaped. The boilers in the basement had to be fed coal every single day to keep the radiators hot in winter. The house had to work. And that required people. A lot of people. People no one ever talked about. Until now. Because in 1924, when Big Edie bought Grey Gardens, the house came with something most historians ignore, an entire, invisible machine of human labor. Let's pull back the curtain and meet the ghost staff. The ghost staff of 1924. Unlike the romantic narratives that focus on eccentric owners and tragic decline, we're going to do something most historians skip entirely. We're going to perform a labor audit. Because when Big Edie purchased Grey Gardens in 1924 for $53,000, roughly $850,000 in today's money, she didn't just buy a house. She bought a machine, and every machine needs operators. The United States Census records from 1920 and 1930 give us the names. The immigration documents give us the nationalities. And the household expense ledgers, preserved in East Hampton archives, give us the wages. Let me walk you through the invisible hands that kept Grey Gardens alive. At the top of the hierarchy, the butler. His name was Charles, Irish immigrant. 42 years old in 1924. His job was to manage the other staff, serve meals, and ensure that guests never saw the machinery operating. His annual salary, $1,200. That's roughly $21,000 today. Below him, the head housekeeper, Margaret. German, 50 years old. She supervised the cleaning of 14 rooms, managed the linen inventory, and ensured that not a single speck of dust existed anywhere a guest might notice. Her salary, $900 annually, roughly $16,000 today. Then came the cook, the lady's maid, 2 general housemaids, a laundress, a groundskeeper who maintained 4 acres of gardens, a chauffeur who drove Big Edie into Manhattan whenever she needed to be seen at the right parties. At the bottom, day laborers hired seasonally, recent immigrants, mostly Italian and Polish, who worked the vegetable gardens, repaired the shingles, and did the jobs too dirty for the permanent staff. They were paid by the day, roughly $3. $53 in modern terms. Total staff count during peak summer season, 12 to 15 people. Total annual cost just for wages, not including room and board, approximately $8,000. That's $140,000 today, every single year, just to keep the machine running. And here's the part that matters, the part that explains everything that comes next. This wasn't optional. A house like Grey Gardens couldn't function without this infrastructure. The coal furnaces in the basement required daily stoking. The gardens required constant labor, or they would return to wild beach scrub within a single season. The kitchen, the plumbing, the roof, every system required maintenance. When the staff disappeared, the house didn't just get dirty. It began to die. And in 1946, the staff did disappear. All of them. In a single week. Because that's the year everything collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually. In one devastating telegram. 1946. Big Edie and Phelan Beale have been married for 29 years, and for most of those years, the marriage has been a performance. Phelan stays in Manhattan during the week, managing his law practice. Big Edie stays at Grey Gardens, hosting parties, cultivating her image as the beautiful bohemian who married into New York society. But the performance is cracking. Phelan wants a divorce. He's been planning it for years. And in 1946, he finally pulls the trigger. But not in person. By telegram. Imagine that. 29 years of marriage ended with a telegram delivered to the front door of Grey Gardens by a teenage messenger boy who has no idea he's carrying a detonation device. The settlement is brutal. Phelan keeps the Manhattan properties. He keeps the investment portfolio. He keeps the social connections and the legal clients. Big Edie gets Grey Gardens. And an allowance. $300 per month. Let me convert that for you. $300 in 1946 is roughly $5,000 in today's money. Now that might sound livable, until you remember what we just discussed. The annual cost to maintain Grey Gardens with a full staff, $8,000 a year, $140,000 today. Big Edie's total annual income from the divorce settlement, $3,600, $63,000 today. The math doesn't work. It was never supposed to work. This wasn't a divorce settlement designed to let Big Edie continue her lifestyle. This was an execution. Within 6 months, the entire staff is gone. Charles the butler, Margaret the housekeeper, the cook, the gardener, the maids. All of them dismissed because there's no money to pay them. And here's where the story of Grey Gardens truly begins. Because little Edie, who had been living in Manhattan, pursuing a modeling career, attending parties, being courted by men from families just as wealthy as hers, makes a decision in 1952. She comes home to take care of her mother. She tells herself it's temporary, just until Big Edie gets back on her feet, just until the financial situation stabilizes. It's not temporary. Little Edie will never leave Grey Gardens again. Not for 25 years. And without the invisible machine, without the 12 to 15 people whose labor kept the house functioning, Grey Gardens begins to do what all houses do when the machinery stops. It starts to rot. The gardens become overgrown. The shingles begin to split and fall. The gutters fill with leaves and the roof starts to leak. The plumbing fails because no one's maintaining it. The heating system breaks down because no one's feeding the boilers. And most importantly, the house stops being a home. It becomes something else. A fortress, a prison, a living organism that's slowly digesting the two women trapped inside it. Because that's what happens when architecture loses its support system. It doesn't just decay, it becomes pathology. And in the 1960s, as America transforms around them, as the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War rage outside their overgrown hedges, Big Edie and Little Edie retreat deeper and deeper into Grey Gardens. Let's examine what the house looked like when it stopped being architecture and became a diagnosis. By 1965, Grey Gardens has been without professional maintenance for nearly 20 years. And the transformation is complete. This is no longer a mansion. It's a medical chart, a physical manifestation of psychological withdrawal. Let me show you what I mean. The kitchen. Remember the kitchen that once employed a professional cook that produced meals for senators and socialites? By the mid-60s, the floor has rotted through, not metaphorically, literally. The structural supports beneath the kitchen have been compromised by water damage from the leaking roofs. And one morning, without warning, a section of the floor simply collapses into the basement below. The stove falls through, the cabinets fall through, pots and pans scatter across the basement floor like evidence at a crime scene. Big Edie and Little Edie stop using the kitchen. They start cooking on a hot plate in the bedroom. Now, most people would see this as the moment to call for help, to admit that the situation has become unlivable. But here's what you need to understand about pathology. The house isn't failing. It's diagnosing. Every broken pipe, every collapsed floor, every raccoon nest in the walls is the house revealing what's happening to the people inside it. Big Edie, who once commanded rooms with her beauty and her singing voice, has stopped leaving the bedroom entirely. She stays in bed, surrounded by newspapers dating back years, feeding the dozens of cats that have taken over the house. The cats aren't pets. They're insulation, they're company, they're the replacement for the human connection that disappeared when the social invitations stopped coming. And Little Edie, who could have left at any time, who had opportunities to marry wealthy men, to restart her modeling career, to escape, makes the decision every single day to stay, not out of duty, out of terror. Because leaving would mean admitting that the last 20 years were a waste, that she sacrificed her youth, her beauty, her chance at life, for a mother who can't be saved and a house that can't be fixed. So instead, she creates an alternative reality. She starts wearing the costumes, the headscarves made from old sweaters, the skirts pinned together with safety pins, the swimming costumes worn as shirts. This isn't fashion. This is armor. It's a way of saying, I'm not trapped. I'm making art. I'm making choices. And the house participates in the delusion. The gardens grow wild, thick walls of privet and oak that block out the neighbors, block out the changing world, block out anyone who might look too closely and see the truth. The windows stay shuttered, the doors stay locked. The phone, when it still works, goes unanswered. Raccoons move into the attic. They tear insulation from the walls to build nests. Their urine soaks through the ceiling and creates brown stains that spread like disease. The two women can hear them at night, scratching, fighting, breeding, and they do nothing, because the raccoons are part of the ecosystem now, part of the house, part of the pathology. By 1970, Grey Gardens contains approximately 52 cats, multiple raccoons, and over 1,000 pounds of accumulated trash. Not hoarded belongings. Trash. Empty cat food cans. Newspapers. Broken furniture. The debris of a life that stopped progressing and started circling. And still, no one intervenes. Because Big Edie and Little Edie are Bouvier, they're connected to Jackie Kennedy. And in America, wealth comes with the privilege of privacy, the privilege of rotting in peace. Until 1971, when the health department finally breaks down the door. Because someone made a phone call. Someone reported the smell, the sounds, the suspicion that something terrible was happening behind those overgrown hedges. And what they found inside was so shocking, it made national news. Suffolk County, New York, October 1971. The health inspectors arrive at 2 West End Road with clipboards, cameras, and face masks. They've received multiple complaints from neighbors about the smell, about the cats, about the suspicion that something deeply wrong is happening inside. What they find exceeds every nightmare scenario they imagined. Let me read you the actual violations from the official report, because this isn't folklore, this is evidence. A crime scene where the victim and the perpetrator are the same entity, the house itself. Violation 1. No running water in the bathrooms. The plumbing system has completely failed. Big Edie and Little Edie have been using buckets and makeshift arrangements for years. Violation 2. No heat. The furnace died in the mid-60s and was never repaired. The 2 women survive East Hampton winters by layering clothing and staying in bed under piles of coats. Violation 3. Kitchen floor collapsed into basement, already documented. The hot plate they're using creates a fire hazard that violates multiple housing codes. Violation 4. 1,128 pounds of garbage and refuse throughout the house. Not an estimate. They weighed it. Cat food cans stacked floor to ceiling in what used to be the formal dining room. Newspapers dating back to the 1940s. Broken furniture that couldn't be thrown out because there was no staff to carry it. Violation 5. 52 cats living inside the house. Not outside. Inside. With no litter boxes. The ammonia smell is so strong that inspectors have to step outside repeatedly to breathe. Violation 6. Raccoons nesting in the attic, walls, and crawl spaces. Evidence of structural damage from their claws and waste. The ceiling in the upstairs hallway has a hole large enough for a grown man to fall through. Violation 7. Severe roof damage with active leaks in 6 rooms. Mold growth visible on walls and ceilings. Wood rot compromising load-bearing beams. The lead inspector files an emergency condemnation order. Grey Gardens is declared uninhabitable. Big Edie and Little Edie are given 2 weeks to vacate or face forcible eviction. And that's when the story goes national. Because the inspectors don't know who these women are. They're just doing their job, enforcing health codes, protecting public safety. But then someone at the county clerk's office recognizes the names on the property deed. Beale, Bouvier, connected to Kennedy. Within 48 hours, the New York Times runs a front-page story. Photographers camp outside the overgrown hedges. Television crews apply for permits to film the exterior. The headline writes itself, Jackie Kennedy's relatives living in squalor. And here's where we need to pause and ask the moral question that most romantic retellings skip entirely. How did this happen? Not mechanically. We've already covered the financial autopsy, the disappeared staff, the systemic collapse. But ethically. How does a family connected to American royalty, a family with enough wealth and status to protect itself from almost anything, how do they let 2 of their own rot inside a condemned mansion for 25 years? The Bouvier had money. Not Big Edie's branch, but the broader family. Major Bouvier's estate. Jackie Kennedy's resources. The collective wealth of a bloodline built on Wall Street speculation and strategic marriages. They knew. The family knew what was happening at Grey Gardens. They'd stopped visiting in the early 60s. Stopped inviting Big Edie and Little Edie to family gatherings. Stopped returning phone calls. But they never intervened. Because intervention would have required acknowledging the decay, and acknowledging the decay would have meant admitting that the Bouvier myth, the old money fantasy of effortless grace and inherited superiority, was exactly that. A myth. The same system that built Grey Gardens, that staffed it with invisible immigrant labor, that maintained the gardens with the sweat of day workers paid $3 a shift, That system had no mechanism for mercy when the money ran out. You were either useful or invisible, and Big Edie and Little Edie had become invisible, until the health department made them visible. And suddenly the family had a scandal. But scandals, when they involve Kennedys, don't follow normal rules, because one phone call from the right person can change everything. And in late October 1971, that phone call was made. The phone call comes from Jackie Kennedy's office. Not from Jackie herself. She's too strategic to leave fingerprints. But from her attorney, her financial manager, someone empowered to solve problems quietly. The message to the Suffolk County Health Department is simple. Give us 30 days. We'll fix it. And they do. Not alone. Jackie's sister, Lee Radziwill, joins the effort. Together they mobilize resources that have been dormant for 25 years. Not because they care about Big Edie and Little Edie, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Imagine the photographs. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, recently remarried to Aristotle Onassis, one of the wealthiest men in the world, while her aunt and cousin are forcibly removed from a condemned house by sheriff's deputies. The public reaction would be devastating. So the machinery of privilege, dormant for 25 years, suddenly activates. Jackie Kennedy personally contributes $32,000. That's roughly $230,000 in today's money. Lee Radziwill adds funds. Other members of the Bouvier family contribute another $20,000. Investment income from old trusts is redirected. Lawyers negotiate extensions with the county. And then the work crews arrive. Not to restore Grey Gardens. That would cost hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. But to bring it up to minimum code. To make it technically habitable so the eviction order can be lifted. They haul out 1,128 pounds of garbage. They trap and remove the 52 cats, relocating them to shelters. They seal the holes where raccoons were entering. They patch the roof enough to stop the active leaks. They restore running water to one bathroom. They install a small electric heating system in 2 rooms. The kitchen floor that collapsed into the basement? They simply close off the kitchen, board it up, declare it off limits. Big Edie and Little Edie will continue cooking on the hot plate in the bedroom. The renovation, if you can call it that, takes 6 weeks. The condemnation order is lifted in December 1971. Big Edie and Little Edie are allowed to stay, and the family breathes a collective sigh of relief. Crisis averted. Scandal managed. The Kennedy name protected. But here's what they don't anticipate. The press coverage. The photographs of the overgrown gardens and the boarded-up windows. The whispered stories about the reclusive Bouvier women living like ghosts in a haunted mansion. All of that attention has caught someone else's eye. 2 documentary filmmakers named Albert and David Maysles. Brothers who specialize in direct cinema, in pointing cameras at unusual people and letting reality speak for itself. They've made films about door-to-door Bible salesmen, about the Rolling Stones' disastrous Altamont concert. They're interested in America's hidden corners, in the places where the official narrative cracks open and something raw and true spills out. And Grey Gardens, post-scandal, is exactly that kind of crack. In 1973, the Maysles brothers knock on the door of 2 West End Road. They have a proposal. Let us film you. Let us document your lives exactly as they are. No scripts, no judgment, just observation. Little Edie, who has been invisible for so long, who has watched her beauty fade and her opportunities vanish while the world forgot she existed, sees something in this offer. A chance to be seen again. She says yes, and that decision will change everything. Because when the Maysles brothers' cameras finally enter Grey Gardens and start rolling, they don't capture a tragedy. They capture something far more complicated. Something that will haunt American culture for the next 50 years. The Maysles brothers spend 6 weeks at Grey Gardens in the summer of 1975. And what they capture is unlike anything American cinema has seen before. This isn't a documentary about poverty. These aren't homeless people or victims of systemic neglect in the traditional sense. These are women from one of America's most privileged families, living in self-imposed isolation, performing a reality that exists nowhere else. The camera watches Big Edie, now 79 years old, lying in bed surrounded by cats, singing songs from her youth, reminiscing about the men who courted her, the parties she attended, the life she almost had. The camera watches little Edie, 57 years old, dancing through the rooms in her makeshift costumes, scarves wrapped around her head, skirts safety-pinned at odd angles, performing monologues about her mother, her lost opportunities, her conviction that she could have been a star. They argue, constantly, about the past, about whose fault the present is, about whether little Edie should have left when she had the chance. They feed the cats. They cook simple meals on the hot plate. They dance. They sing. They exist in a house that's falling apart around them. But they exist as if the house is still grand, as if the decay is just temporary, as if any day now things will return to what they were. And the Maysles brothers don't interfere. They don't ask leading questions. They don't stage scenes. They don't impose a narrative of tragedy or redemption. They just watch. And in watching, they reveal something profound about the relationship between architecture and psychology. The house isn't just decaying. It's performing. Every collapsed floor, every raccoon nest, every pile of newspapers is part of a stage set for a play that Big Edie and Little Edie have been rehearsing for 25 years. A play about dignity in decline, about maintaining identity when all external markers of status have vanished. The film is released in 1975 with the simple title, Grey Gardens. The reaction is immediate and divided. Some critics call it exploitative. They argue that filming mentally unwell women without intervention is voyeurism, not art. They accuse the Maysles of profiting from suffering. Other critics call it brilliant. They see it as an unflinching portrait of American class decay, of what happens when old money runs out, of the psychological cost of isolation. But what no one expects is the cult following. Within months, Grey Gardens becomes a midnight movie phenomenon. Young people, especially artists and outsiders, see something in little Edie's defiant performance, in her refusal to conform, in her creation of beauty from scraps. They start quoting her lines, imitating her costumes, throwing Grey Gardens viewing parties where they dress up and recite the dialogue. Little Edie, forgotten for decades, becomes an icon, not for the life she lived, for the performance she gave. And here's the strange truth that the documentary reveals. Big Edie and Little Edie weren't trapped by the house. They were trapped by each other. The house was just the stage. Because Little Edie could have left. Even after the staff disappeared, even after the money ran out, she had opportunities. Marriage proposals, job offers, relatives who would have taken her in. But leaving would have meant abandoning her mother. And abandoning her mother would have meant admitting that she had wasted her life. So she stayed. And the house became the physical manifestation of that choice. Every year she didn't leave, the house got worse. Every collapsed floor was another year sacrificed. Every raccoon nest was another opportunity missed. The camera doesn't judge the decay. It diagnoses it, and what it diagnoses is something the health inspectors couldn't measure. The architecture of regret. But Grey Gardens, the documentary, captures only a moment, a 6-week window into a life that spans decades. And after the cameras leave, after the film crews pack up and drive away, Big Edie and Little Edie return to the only reality they know. The decay continues. Until 1977, when one of them finally leaves. February 5th, 1977. Big Edie dies in her bedroom at Grey Gardens. She is 81 years old. She's surrounded by cats, newspapers, and the remnants of a life that peaked 50 years earlier. Little Edie finds her in the morning, and for the first time in 25 years, Little Edie is alone in the house. completely alone. The documentary has been out for 2 years. Little Edie has tasted something she hasn't experienced since the 1940s. Recognition. Letters arrive from fans. Interview requests. Invitations to appear at film festivals and talk about the movie. For a brief moment, at age 59, Little Edie is famous. But she's also trapped. Because the house that made her famous is the same house that's been slowly killing her for a quarter century. And now, with Big Edie gone, there's no reason to stay. Except that leaving means admitting it was all for nothing. Every sacrifice. Every lost opportunity. Every year spent feeding cats, and watching the roof leak, and sleeping in a bedroom with no heat. If she leaves now, what was it all for? The decision takes months. Little Edie wanders through the 14 rooms, each one a museum of decay. The formal dining room where cat food cans are stacked like archaeological layers. The upstairs hallway with the hole in the ceiling. The kitchen that's still boarded up from the 1971 repairs. The house had completed its diagnosis. The patient was gone. And Little Edie finally makes the choice she should have made in 1952. She decides to sell, but there's a condition, a non-negotiable term that every potential buyer has to accept. Whoever buys Grey Gardens cannot tear it down. They have to restore it, preserve it, treat it as the historical landmark it technically is, even if that history is one of spectacular collapse. Because if the house is destroyed, if it's bulldozed and replaced with some modern beach compound, then what proof remains that Big Edie and Little Edie existed? The house is the evidence, the crime scene, the medical chart. It has to survive. In November 1979, Little Edie finds her buyer, a journalist named Ben Bradlee and his wife, Sally Quinn. Ben Bradlee is the executive editor of The Washington Post, the man who oversaw Watergate coverage, who helped bring down a president. Sally Quinn is a writer, a political observer, someone who understands the weight of history. The sale price, $220,000. That's roughly $1 million in today's money. Little Edie signs the papers, takes the check, and makes one final request. She wants to walk through the house alone, one last time. Sally Quinn, who will later write about this moment in her memoir, describes what Little Edie left behind. She called them shipwreck artifacts. In the bedroom where Big Edie died, a collection of costume jewelry, tarnished and broken, spread across the dresser like offerings at a shrine. In the attic, boxes of photographs from the 1920s and 30s. Big Edie in her prime, Little Edie as a young model. Images of a family that looked immortal. In the garden shed, the rusted tools that the groundskeeper used 70 years earlier, before the staff disappeared, before the machine stopped. And on the wall of the main hallway, a single note, written in Little Edie's handwriting. This house loved us. We loved it back. That's all that matters. Little Edie leaves Grey Gardens in December 1979. She moves to New York City, then briefly to Florida, performing cabaret shows about her life, living off the documentary's cult fame. She will live another 23 years, always performing, always wearing the costumes, always playing the character that the cameras created, but she will never return to Grey Gardens, because the diagnosis was complete. And now, with Little Edie gone, Grey Gardens faces its own choice: die or resurrect. For the first time in 30 years, someone with resources, with vision, with the will to fight the decay, owns the house. The question is whether it's too late. When Ben Bradlee and Sally Quinn take ownership of Grey Gardens in 1979, they hire a structural engineer to assess the damage. The report is devastating. The house is not just decaying, it's actively dying. Load-bearing beams are compromised by rot. The foundation has shifted from decades of water infiltration. The electrical system is a fire hazard. The plumbing is beyond repair. The engineer's recommendation: demolition would be easier and cheaper than restoration. But Bradlee and Quinn didn't buy Grey Gardens to take the easy path. They bought it because they understood what the house represented. Not just architectural history, but American history. The rise and fall of old money. The collapse of the social structures that defined the Gilded Age. And they believed it could be saved. The restoration begins in early 1980. First priority, stabilizing the structure. Steel beams are installed to support the weakened floors. The foundation is reinforced. The roof is completely replaced, not patched, replaced. Cost so far, $60,000, roughly $220,000 today. Next, the interior. Every room has to be gutted. Walls torn down to expose the framing. Floors ripped up to replace the joists. Decades of accumulated damage, of deferred maintenance, of systematic neglect. All of it has to be undone. They find things in the walls. Cat skeletons. Raccoon nests made from shredded insulation. Newspapers from the 1940s used as makeshift weatherproofing. A child's toy from the 1920s, hidden in a crawlspace. Each discovery is a layer of the house's pathology, physically exposed. The kitchen, boarded up since 1971, is completely rebuilt. New appliances, new floor structure, new everything. The bathrooms, where Big Edie and Little Edie used buckets for years, are demolished and reconstructed with modern plumbing. The heating system, dead since the mid-60s, is replaced with a state-of-the-art furnace. And then, the gardens. Because you can't call it Grey Gardens if the gardens are just overgrown beach scrub. Sally Quinn hires landscape architects to study Ruth Dean's original 1913 plans. They discover that many of the original plantings, the roses and the wisteria and the hedges, are still alive under the chaos, just dormant, waiting. The overgrowth is carefully removed. The original pathways are excavated. The lily pond is drained, cleaned, and restocked. The concrete walls, imported from Spain in 1913, crumbling but intact, are restored. And slowly, over the course of 2 years, Grey Gardens emerges from its decay. Not as a museum, as a home. Bradlee and Quinn move in during the summer of 1982. Total restoration cost, approximately $350,000. That's roughly $1.3 million in today's money. More than 6 times what they paid for the house. But here's what the numbers don't capture. The invisible infrastructure that Big Edie lost in 1946, the 12 to 15 people whose labor kept Grey Gardens functioning, that system doesn't come back. Instead, Bradlee and Quinn rely on modern technology, automated heating, low-maintenance landscaping, appliances that don't require a cook and a kitchen staff. The house functions again, but it functions differently. It's no longer a machine that requires human operators. It's a machine that runs itself. And in that transformation, something essential about what Grey Gardens was, what it represented about Gilded Age excess, and the exploitation required to maintain it, something about that original identity is lost. The house is beautiful again, but it's not the same house. It can't be. Because the world that created Grey Gardens, that world of invisible servants and inherited wealth and summer estates maintained by immigrant labor, that world is gone. Bradlee and Quinn will own Grey Gardens for 17 years, hosting parties, raising their children there, living the life that Big Edie and Little Edie could only remember. And then, in 1999, they sell. Because Grey Gardens, despite the restoration, despite the resurrection, carries a weight that's hard to live with. The history is too heavy, the ghosts too present, and the house, even beautiful, even functional, still whispers its diagnosis. But the story doesn't end with one family. Grey Gardens has entered American mythology now, and mythology demands new chapters. 27 years after the documentary's release, Grey Gardens is resurrected again. Not the house, the story. In 2006, a new musical opens at Playwrights Horizons, a small theater in New York City. It's called, simply, Grey Gardens. But this isn't a straight adaptation of the documentary. Instead, the musical does something brilliant. It splits the story in two. Act 1 takes place in 1941, Grey Gardens in its prime. A party is being held to announce little Edie's engagement to Joseph Kennedy Jr., the eldest son of the Kennedy dynasty. On stage, we see the house as it was, elegant, staffed, the invisible machine running perfectly, Big Edie singing, commanding the room, little Edie young and beautiful, her whole life ahead of her. And then, slowly, the engagement falls apart. Joe Kennedy Jr. realizes that little Edie is too artistic, too unconventional, too much like her mother. He breaks it off. The party ends. And the curtain falls on Act 1. When it rises for Act 2, we're in 1973. The Maysles brothers are filming. The house has collapsed. Big Edie is in bed. Little Edie is wearing the costumes. And the same actresses who played them as glamorous socialites in Act 1 now play them as isolated relics. The contrast is devastating. Because what the musical diagnoses, what the documentary could only imply, is the exact moment when the trajectory changed, the exact decision point where little Edie's life forked toward Grey Gardens instead of away from it. It wasn't the divorce in 1946. It was the broken engagement in 1941. That's when little Edie learned that being like her mother, being artistic and defiant and unconventional, was a liability in the marriage market that defined women's value in that era. And if she couldn't be valuable as a wife, what was she? The musical runs for 3 months off-Broadway. The reviews are ecstatic. Then it transfers to Broadway. Walter Kerr Theater, November 2006. The lead actresses, Christine Ebersoleil as Big Edie and Mary Louise Wilson as Little Edie, give performances that transcend impersonation. They inhabit the pathology. They make you understand how love and resentment can coexist, how duty and imprisonment are sometimes the same thing. The musical is nominated for 10 Tony Awards. It wins 3, including Best Actress for Christine Ebersoleil. And suddenly, Grey Gardens is back in the cultural conversation. A new generation discovers the story. Young women who never saw the documentary, who weren't alive in 1975, discover little Edie's defiance, her refusal to be diminished, even when everything around her is literally falling apart. She becomes once again an icon. Not for suffering, for survival, for creating art from decay, for turning a trap into a stage. The musical runs for more than 500 performances on Broadway. It tours nationally. It's produced in London, in Australia, in regional theaters across America. And every performance is a seance, summoning Big Edie and Little Edie back from the grave, letting them sing again, letting them be seen, letting them win, in retrospect, the battle they lost in real time. The battle against invisibility. But the musical isn't the only way Grey Gardens haunts contemporary culture. Because Little Edie's most visible legacy isn't in song, it's in fashion, in the way she turned poverty into style, necessity into choice, isolation into performance. Let's examine how a woman who lived in rags became a fashion icon. Here's what Little Edie wore in the documentary. A bathing suit as a shirt, wool skirts held together with oversized safety pins, sweaters wrapped around her head like turbans, brooches pinned at angles that made no conventional sense. To the health inspectors in 1971, this looked like mental illness. To the Maysles brothers filming in 1975, it looked like eccentricity. But to the fashion world watching decades later, it looked like genius. Because what Little Edie created wasn't poverty fashion. This was survival architecture. Think about it. She had no money for new clothes, No access to department stores or tailors. The radiators didn't work, so she needed layers. The house was falling apart, so nothing could be precious or permanent. Every outfit was assembled from what remained. From the wreckage of her former life as a model and socialite. From the drawer of old scarves and the closet of moth-eaten sweaters, and the jewelry box full of tarnished brooches. She took the fragments and built something new. Not fashion, armor. And in doing so, she accidentally created one of the most influential aesthetic statements of the 20th century. The documentary made Little Edie visible to a small cult audience in 1975, but it's the internet, decades later, that makes her immortal. Fashion bloggers discovered Grey Gardens in the early 2000s. They screenshot Little Edie's outfits. They analyzed the layering, the color combinations, the fearless mixing of textures and patterns. High fashion designers start referencing her explicitly. Marc Jacobs creates a collection inspired by Little Edie's headscarves. Rei Kawakubo at Comme des Garçons deconstructs clothing using safety pins and asymmetrical draping. The entire aesthetic of fashion as rebellion, of deliberately breaking the rules of what clothing is supposed to look like, traces a direct line back to Grey Gardens. Because Little Edie proved something radical. You don't need money to have style. You don't need access to have vision. You just need the courage to look at what you have and refuse to be ashamed of it. The headscarf wrapped from an old sweater isn't poverty, it's a crown. The skirt pinned together isn't desperation, it's sculpture. The bathing suit worn as a top isn't madness, it's innovation. And suddenly, women who feel trapped by conventional beauty standards, who can't afford designer clothes, who live in bodies or situations that don't fit the glossy magazine ideal, they see Little Edie and recognize something. Not pity. Permission. Permission to make their own rules, to create beauty from limitation, to perform their own identity instead of accepting the one society hands them. Little Edie becomes a patron saint of outsiders, of queer fashion, of punk aesthetics, of anyone who ever felt too strange, too poor, too unconventional to belong. The irony is almost unbearable. In life, Little Edie desperately wanted to be accepted, to be beautiful in the conventional sense, to marry well, to be invited to the right parties. She failed at all of that. But in death, in cultural memory, she succeeds at something far more important. She becomes proof that the people who don't fit, who can't conform, who build their identities from scraps and refuse and the wreckage of broken expectations, they're not failures. They're architects, building shelter from the decay. But cultural influence, fashion iconography, Broadway musicals, all of that is legacy, mythology, the story after the story. Grey Gardens, the actual house, the physical structure at 2 West End Road, still exists, still stands, still demands an answer to the question, what does it mean now? Let's return to the present. After Ben Bradlee and Sally Quinn sell Grey Gardens in 1999, the house changes hands several times. Each owner restores a little more, modernizes a little more, erases a little more of the history that made it famous. By 2017, Grey Gardens is unrecognizable from the house the health department condemned in 1971. And that's when fashion designer Liz Lang buys it. Purchase price, $15.5 million. That's roughly $19.7 million in today's money. Think about that number for a moment. The same house that sold for $220,000 in 1979, the house that Big Edie couldn't maintain on $300 a month, is now worth $15.5 million. Not despite its history. Because of it, Grey Gardens is no longer just a house. It's a brand, a story, a piece of American mythology that happens to have 4 acres of beachfront attached. Liz Lang knows this. She's not buying a house, she's buying a legend, and she treats it accordingly. The restoration continues. The gardens, already beautiful from the Bradlee Quinn era, are expanded with native coastal plantings. The interior is decorated with a careful balance of historical accuracy and modern comfort. You can still see the shingle-style bones. The original Joseph Greenleaf Thorpe architecture is intact. But the kitchen doesn't fall through the floor. The roof doesn't leak. There are no raccoons in the attic. The house has been completely sterilized of its pathology. And that raises a question. Is this still Grey Gardens? Or is this just a very expensive beach house that happens to occupy the same plot of land where something important once happened? Because the house that Big Edie and Little Edie lived in, the house that the documentary captured, that house was defined by its decay, by the gaps between what it was supposed to be and what it had become. The house that exists now has no gaps. It's perfect, maintained, functional. Everything the original Grey Gardens was not. Liz Lang lives there privately. She doesn't give tours. She doesn't open it to the public. She doesn't have to explain or justify or perform the history. She simply owns it. And in a strange way, that's the final diagnosis. Grey Gardens has come full circle. It started as a private estate for the wealthy, a place where servants worked invisibly so that the owners could live beautifully. It collapsed when the money ran out and the invisible machine stopped. It became famous when two women refused to leave and cameras documented the decay. And now, more than a century after it was built, it's returned to exactly what it was always meant to be, a private estate for the wealthy. The only difference is that now everyone knows what it cost, not just in dollars, in lives, in years, in the slow erosion of two women who loved the house so much they let it consume them. The house survived. They didn't. And that's the story Grey Gardens will always tell, no matter how beautiful the restoration, no matter how many millions it sells for. Some houses are haunted by ghosts. Grey Gardens is haunted by a diagnosis that can never be fully erased. Which brings us to the end, to the final audit, not of the house, but of what the house teaches us about beauty, decay, love, and the cost of holding on when everything tells you to let go. Grey Gardens stands at 2 West End Road today. The shingles are perfect. The gardens are immaculate. The concrete walls imported from Spain in 1913 have been restored to their original grandeur. If you drive past it, you'd never know. You'd never know about the kitchen that fell through the floor, about the 52 cats, about the 1,000 pounds of trash, about two women who loved each other and resented each other and couldn't leave each other, trapped inside a house that became the physical manifestation of their relationship. You'd never know about Charles the butler and Margaret the housekeeper and the 12 to 15 invisible hands whose labor kept the machine running until the money disappeared and they disappeared with it. You'd never know that this house, this beautiful shingle-style masterpiece, was once a crime scene where the victim and the perpetrator were the same entity. But now you do, because we didn't tell you a romantic story about eccentric socialites. We performed an autopsy. We diagnosed how a house becomes pathology, how architecture stops being shelter and starts being symptom, how the invisible machine of privilege only works until someone stops paying, and then it collapses all at once, taking everyone inside with it. Grey Gardens teaches us that beauty without infrastructure is just decay waiting to happen, that love without resources becomes imprisonment. That holding on, when everything tells you to let go, doesn't make you noble. It makes you a case study. Big Edie and Little Edie are gone, but the house remains, and it will outlast all of us. Because houses don't die the way people do. They just wait for the next owner, the next story, the next diagnosis. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into Gilded Age architecture and the hidden machinery behind American mythology, there are more stories like this waiting. Subscribe to the channel. And remember, we don't romanticize ruins. We diagnose them. This was Grey Gardens. The house that ate its owners alive.